Hello. So continuing on from where we left off in the previous stream. So this is what we ended up with Snowball in Studio with our normal maps and our shininess maps. So taking a look at this in Blender, so what we've got actually in Studio is we've got the Snowball texture. That's that one. Then we've got the neck texture, which is underneath, but we've also created a face as a separate image, or a separate section that we can apply a separate image to, and that helps. Well, it helps with the face alignment, because if we look at this in Blender, so this is what we have in Blender. So we've got a couple of materials assigned to this. We'll replace these in a second with the actual images, but this is just so that we can see clearly which sections of the mesh are what. So we have our Snowball materials. So we have our Snowball. Let's go into edit mode. So we'll select that in the material list, and then we'll just click the select button, and that selects the Snowball. So that's the Snowball material. Whoops, make sure we don't have anything else. Let's do that again. Faces. So that's all the Snowball material, and the UV map for that is that. But where's the texture? So that's our texture map. Now, the reason why we've got a separate face section, so that's the purple section, so we can select that. So make sure, whoops, behave yourself. So select none, face material, select, and we'll swap that texture so that we can see it, which is there. So we have a separate face section, because what we can do with that is lay out the UV map more, it's not uniformly, uniformly is not the right word, but it allows us to flatten out the face. Excuse me. It allows us to flatten out the face so that when we do our face elements on it, they map out across the surface correctly, because we have a flat or flatter UV map. If we were to do the same sort of thing, let's deselect. Actually, let's select. Whoops, not that one. Deselect. Select. Let's just hide that. So if we were to select the face UVs, where is it? And if we were then to draw a face on our UV map somewhere, let's just go into texture paint for a second. Scroll out. Let's just choose a color. Change the size of the brush. So that's probably there then. So that's a bit big, but you can get a sense of the problem. Let's just paint over that just to clear that out. So we've got to try and determine where the face is that we want to paint or would want our face appearing on. Let's make this darker and easier to see. So that's the area that we might otherwise want to paint on this image. So let's plonk a couple of eyes on there. Like so. So what we have is our texture occupying, or our face basically occupying this much space. And our texture is obviously this big. So that is going to be approximately what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So our face area is 1/8 the size of the overall image. And that means that if we were wanting to do, although this is just a very simple face, if you were wanting to do something where there was some detail involved, you'd be dealing with pixels, individual pixels, trying to define whatever detail you would want on your image. So let's say, for example, whoops, let's just do a little shape. Like so. Because we are using a relatively small area of the texture to define that shape, the result on the actual object is a little blurry. So let's just, if I toggle out of edit mode, we're going to get the face mask. So select none and hide. So Alt H. Whoops. Select P just to detach so that we can hide that object. It's going to be slightly blurry, but if we separate the face and map that to a specific section, we then have a much larger area, relatively speaking, that we can paint to, so our details are much clearer. obviously the UV map is a little wonky in the sense of its borders aren't aligned and uniform. So when you're doing your UV maps for things like this, you want to try and conform to the shape of the mesh itself instead of doing what sometimes can be done, which is straightening out the UVs. You want to avoid doing that. So for example, what often is done, or what people sometimes do, is straighten out the UVs and make it a square, because if you do that, it distorts, or can distort, the resulting. So if we just do this quickly. So we're setting the boundary of the image. Just going to pin, not the image, the UV map. Just going to pin these. UV pin, and then just remap, just so that it sorts out the UVs relative to that shape. When you do that, it distorts, or can distort, the UVs. So if you painted an actual circle on here, onto your texture, what it can sometimes end up doing is distorting the circle so that it doesn't actually end up being shown as a circle. It can be distorted because of the way that UVs and surfaces are orientated relative to one another. So this set of triangles is defined by this diagonal, but that diagonal could go across this way, and in doing so it might distort the UV and the way that the image is mapped to it, which could cause an oval shape instead of a circle. But let's use, whoops, what happened there? Oh, we crashed. So that's what we have, well, that's what we ended up with in Studio. And the way that we do that, so once we've got our snowball, our original mesh sorted out, all we do to create the face section is duplicate a section of the mesh. Let's just hide this for the moment. Materials, select, hide. So all we're doing is selecting a section of the mesh that we want the face to appear on, and then duplicating that. So mesh, duplicate, so Shift D, that creates a separate, well, a duplicate section of that selected mesh, so it's carrying any materials, any UV maps, etc. that the original had across into the duplicate. So we create the duplicate, and then to make this section, this next step easier, what we can do is mesh, separate, selection. That separates into it into a completely different object. So let's hide that. So we now have a completely separate section that we can assign a new material to. So if we didn't need any of these, we could get rid of them, create a new material. So we're clicking the plus sign That creates our new instance. Then we click new. That creates a new set of properties, and we can just tint this just so that we can see it being different from the rest of the mesh. It's still got a UV map, but we want to address that because it's not going to be the same as the snowball. We want this to be the full area that we can assign. So in our shading group, shading editor, we need to create our material for this, or not create, we need to add image texture, drop in, color to base color, create a new image, face 2, and this one can be 256 by 256. Blank, color grid, okay. So that's our image assigned to that section. And then all we do is UV unwrap this. So select all. That's the UV map. Where is it? Phase 2. There it is, phase 2. So even if we were to change the smushing of that, because the original was mapped to a 256 by 512, so that means it's twice the size. So the UV map that we've copied over is squashed left to right. So what we could do is just straighten that out and scale it up. So that would be using the original UV mapping, but we've just scaled it up, or we just do a completely new unwrap, and that will sort itself out relative. So rotate that round. Which way are we? And for shapes like this, you have to watch out for because it's not exactly the same size left to right, top to bottom. So Blender will try its best to fit the shape within the available texture bounds, which will rotate it on an odd angle. So if we then rotate this back to fix that, we're going to be slightly over the texture border. And you want to try and fix this if that happens, because what we do later in IMVU or in Studio is we're using an alpha mask or an opacity mask to define the shape, the face itself, so that we have just the eyes cut out of the overall texture, so that we get clean edges and we don't end up with what can sometimes happen is you get a little border around the area that you've duplicated because the texture density has changed between the two. So we've increased the size of the face mask relative to the rest of the head, which can often mean at the border where our face, it doesn't blend, but where our face blends to the rest of the head, we get a line appearing. So we want to make sure that we avoid that by doing two things. In Blender, we must make sure that our UV map does not cross over. Again, this is when we're using masks to define the face of our objects. Well, it's a face in this example, but it could be anything. We need to make sure that our masks, or the UV map that will eventually be masked out, doesn't cross the texture border, because what that'll do is it'll wrap this section of the UV that's poking out over the border, it'll wrap that back into, so it tiles it essentially, so this section and this section, so this bit tiles up, which then becomes this, and this bit tiles down, which becomes this. So if you don't make sure that your borders are clean, you can cause problems with your opacities as it tries to as it tries to wrap around your UV and your image. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of transparency has that border around it that you can't seem to get rid of. So keep an eye out for that. But what were we talking about? Yes, so that's the face mask. And then for the neck, all we've done for the neck is just duplicated the section of the avatar that we want. We'll do this on the male avatar if we get time, because this is the female avatar obviously at the moment, but we'll do a male version. So we've duplicated that section of the mesh. Same again, duplicate. Separated that. And then joined it to our head mesh and done a little bit of editing to get it into shape. Hide the torso. Just hide that section that we just created. Just done a little bit of editing so that we end up with this blood overlap. Same again, that's defined by transparency, so we have to map that neck, so we have to map that to its own section, its own texture that will accommodate as doing a transparency within the bounds of the UV map. So let's just reopen this, clean the file, save, and let's just rebuild the materials using our actual textures. So replace the diffuse all the way down. Where is it? It's doing the head. Let's get rid of the wireframe for the moment. So that's the head. Select the material for the face. So we can see from this that our face is painted over a 256 by 256, and the white background uses the same background as the head, the main head section, but it's masked out. But we can see it here, we've got a border around the face area because the texture mapping, the texture density is different between the two of them, And of course, we're using slightly different areas of the same image. So that's the face. So we want the neck. Which is that one. And now for the purposes of IMVU, I'm previewing. What we can do is set up our materials in a way that we take advantage of Blender's ability to render and view normal maps. So add a new image. Open and load in our normal maps. So which one are we on? Neck. That's the neck normal map. Connect color to normal. So color to normal. And if that gives us any issues, which this looks like it might be doing, let's just double check that's smooth shaded. It is. What we can do is add vector normal map. You don't always need to do this, but sometimes it helps clarify the way that normal maps work. So normal map, and drop that between our texture map and the principled BSDF. And that'll sort out some of the issues that sometimes occur when using normal maps. So we can also reduce the shininess. So do that with the other ones. Face. Open. Oh, and so color to normal. So that gives us that. Let's just. So the normal map's not quite working properly there. So vector normal map. Drop that in. And there is our normal map and our eyes. And if you want, you can also change the normal map to non-color. And then finally, the head itself. Texture, image texture. Normal, open, color to normal map. And again, that makes the normals behave a little odd, so add vector normal map. Drop that in there, and it straightens it out a little bit. Non-color. So we can see, well, that's the materials basically set up. Let's just do the. So that's the basic snowball texture, but going back to the face, so how do we get rid of this? The border around our object. Well, that is where our opacity mask comes into play. Texture, image texture. So we're going to drop another one in, open. We're loading in our opacity, which is just a simple image, and connecting that color output to alpha input. It'll do this first because all we've done is defined what image is controlling the transparency. What we then need to do is instruct Blender to actually make that image or that material transparent, and we do that material properties, and as we're in cycles, we were using cycles previously, remember we were using cycles to render our normal maps. So materials, so for this we need to be in viewport display, not settings, because settings are a component of viewport display when we're in cycles. Enable alpha clip. And voila, that border's gone. Because what we've done is clipped the effect or the section of the face that we want using our mask. So if we were in EV, cycles, EV, material, it's in settings. So the settings properties, depending on whether we're using EV or cycles, where that block of properties appears differs. In fact, where's that tutorial I just published on that? Where those settings appear will differ depending on whether you're using cycles or EV. So what we can do now, whilst we're in EV actually, is layout. Let's switch to rendered. Add light point. And because of the scale difference, we have to make the value of these lights massive. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But we can see the normals doing their thing. So this is just a flat plane, remember? There's no 3D structure to this at all. But we can see how the normal maps should be working in IMVU. But of course in IMVU we have fixed source light sources, so we don't get to see this normalized effect too much. Let's just duplicate that. Let's do a simple 3-point light setup. No shadows. Duplicate that. Move to the back. Let's do it down there. And that's no shadows. So our shadows are just coming from our primary light source. So that is Snowball. Let's just save this. File save as 12. And of course for exporting, we can also, the neck also uses an opacity. So let's load that in. There it is. Color alpha. So it'll do the same thing again. And then all we do is, as we're in EV now, because we switched engines, the settings are just as a subsection within material properties. So opaque, alpha clip, deselect, and there is our blood transition. The Snowball's head being plonked on the avatar's neck. Just save over that, save. But this gives us a preview. Let's just go into full screen. This basically gives us a preview, or a good way of previewing IMVU's material setup in terms of what the material might actually look like in IMVU. So we have our diffuse, which is the snow texture. Oh no, this is the neck. So this is the blood texture. This is the blood normal map, which is corrected for rendering in Blender. And then we've got the mask. So if we export this, the FBX file that we produce will have this hierarchy in place, and it will see at least the diffuse and the mask. I'm not sure if it doesn't see the normal map because of this node being in place. So when Studio imports FBXs with this setup, it may not recognize the normal map because of the interference that's being put in place by this node. Studio doesn't know what this node is, so it may ignore this. But, whoops. So that's our basic IMVU Studio material preview with mask and normal map, and we're using shininess here with the, oh, that's another one that we could add. So let's add a shininess. Let's do it on the face because it's a bit more obvious. So face, add texture, image texture, open. Where is it? There it is. So color, in this case, color goes to specular. So drag and drop, click drag, drop that onto specular. So now the shininess is being controlled by the image that we've loaded into the specular slot. So diffuse, specular, mask, normal map, and for Blender the normal map node that helps clarify some of the normal map issues for rendering. And then for the face, it's just a simple diffuse and normal map. We could stick the specular on this one as well. Texture, image texture. But this is a good way of previewing what your products might look like in Studio using Blender. So drag and drop. No mask. Whoops. And then if we export this, have to make these light sources very powerful to compensate for the scale difference between IMVU and Blender. So file, save. So let's just do a test export for this. So head, skeleton. So what we've got with our mesh is each of the sections. that were separate sections so that they were easier to work on are joined together so that we have a single solid, or what's the phrase, a closed mesh. So everything is joined together into a single mesh. 3 materials, and we've got our material names. Remember that Studio in particular does not like names with spaces in them. So if we did snow space ball space material ID, this can cause issues in Studio because it doesn't like spaces. So make sure your names are all just single words. Mesh, skeleton, file, export, FBX. This is number 12, and again, selected objects. Everything else is okay. Geometry, that's all right. Armatures, always disable add leaf bones. Disable bake animation because we don't have any. And then just export. So we can see what that does in Studio when we import it. So that's what we ended up with. So create body, heads. There should be a empty here somewhere, empty head. And they can't have done one yet. But anyway, so female head, derive, import our asset, import FBX. This is number 12. Open. So that's our preview. 3 skeletons, 2 meshes, 6 materials, which means it probably hasn't brought in the normal maps. Setup FBX, scale 0.01. Make sure to select the skeleton with the lowest number of bones, usually 87 for the clothing starter file. Mesh ID, we're replacing the head, so 0. Next. Oh, it has brought the normal maps in. Excellent. So it has. It's recognized our material structure and brought in everything. So we can, in fact, do a full preview in Blender of our mesh, set it all up, and it'll bring in all that assets. Normal map, mask, face. So there's no opacity, but there is a normal map. So let's just bring that in, no animation. So that's what it's going to bring in, and then import. And there it auto assembles everything. So all we need to do is just tweak some of the settings. So the neck, for example, we can change the threshold of the alpha, so it's using alpha test, and it reduces how strong the clipping is. Is that increase or decrease? I can never remember. Yeah, so that decreases. So closer to 0, it decreases the transparency or the amount of clipping. And closer to 1, it increases the amount of clipping that goes on. So double-sided. Double-sided inside the head. And there we have. It's obviously kept the hair mesh because So how do we override that? Don't think we can do that at the moment. But that has been reported as an issue that needs to be addressed to the studio team. And that's not too far off. So if we put them side by side, how do we close this? Can we close it? No. Oh. Whoops. Can you go full screen with the don't think you can go full screen, but that isn't that far off in terms of like for like comparison. Obviously notwithstanding the lighting that's in the scene that we're using in IMVU Studio. It's a bit brighter obviously for the head because we don't have the same sort of control over the light sources, but we can fully assemble products in Blender with the normal maps and the shininess maps in place, and it will more or less be exactly the same in Studio. Which is pretty cool. Right, so I think we'll call it quits there. I don't really have time to go through setting up this head for the male avatar, so that may be another stream where we just go through the basic process of, as we have the head made already, what we would then have to do is append this into the male starter file. So let's just save this. We would append that into the male clothing starter file. Drop that in, and then we'd make some adjustments to it to accommodate the differences to the male avatar's neck and head area. So once we've got the head in, we'll duplicate this section of the mesh, join it to our head, and then just make some adjustments. The face, that can remain the same. So all of this, that remains the same. The textures on the head remain the same. And we might be able to just use the same texture for the neck with some minor adjustments to accommodate any differences in the UV map, because there's likely to be some. So we'll go over that in the next follow-up video. That should be, we'll be able to do that. What day is it today? Sunday, so Monday, Tuesday. Yeah, it's Sunday, so next week sometime. Right, so that's the first follow-up. The next follow-up will be sorting that out on the male's head. So, thanks for lurking, lurkers, and we shall see you on the next video.